I'm here to represent the ERC Food Cult project, which explores diet and also food cultures in Ireland in the 16th and 17th centuries. So early modern to historians like myself, and post-medieval to archaeologists. And as Sharon said, beer is just one aspect of this. It's a very big project with lots of work packages. Beer is just one of many. But I'm really delighted to be here today to present some process and some findings, not least because national monuments and the archaeological community in Ireland have been hugely supportive of this project to date. So it's really great to be able to share some of this research now. So why brew beer? Well, it probably seems quite a trivial pursuit given some of the more lofty topics that we've heard discussed already today, but ale and beer were really vital to life in the past. So unlike today, when consumption is predominantly recreational, pre-modern drinking was much more multifunctional. So much drinking was indeed linked to leisure activities, and it played a really important role in the social lubrication of communities. But these drinks were also of immense nutritional significance. And they weren't, as people often believe, consumed because the water was so bad. That's quite a big misunderstanding. They were consumed because in contemporary dietetic understandings, fermented drinks benefited the constitution. So they served to balance your humors. Beer was a much warmer drink in humoral terms than water, so much healthier. It helped digestion and perspiration. It helped to quench thirst, and especially when it was hopped. So from the middle of the 16th century on, beer in Ireland, as elsewhere, tended to be hopped, and ale as well was hopped. And this was seen to have added nutritional benefits as well. And they were also considered liquid nourishment, really, to sustain hard work. And the provision of these drinks was an obligation by employers. It was expected if you worked for a castle or for a cathedral that you'd be paid or recompensed in some beer. So the proctor at Christ Church Cathedral, who's left us some very nice records, Peter Lewis in the 1560s, he had to brew beer every 10 days to sustain his stonemasons. And the harder the labour, the better quality the drink that was provided to the men. And levels of consumption were indeed extremely high. And this is not just the case in Ireland, but throughout Europe. We know from the records at Dublin Castle, for example, in the late 16th century, where beer was brewed weekly, that household staff drank upwards of 5 pints a day. And at Christchurch, skilled workers possibly consumed an average of 10.5 to 12 pints of hopped ale per day, with consumption maybe reaching 15.5 pints when they were undertaking very heavy work, such as working late at night, or digging, working in water and in bad conditions, and so on. We also know that consumption varied with the seasons. We can track things like that in the records, but it tended to be higher in the summer months when people were thirstier. And all of this, these high levels of consumption, excluded recreational drinking. This is just what you consumed at work. So all of this, for historians, has always raised lots of interesting questions. So how much energy did people derive from beer as a foodstuff? Again, we know that the proctor at Christchurch spent as much on beer as he did on bread. It's that fundamental to diet on some days. So how much energy could people derive from it? What's its broader nutritional value in terms of its vitamin content, its protein, and so on? And probably most important, and certainly in the context of the theme of today's conference, were early modern workers perpetually drunk? It's a question that has always vexed historians, and it's an important one. We giggle at the idea, but it is important because some agreement on potential levels of drunkenness is a very important step towards understanding not just health, but issues around the politics of sociability and popular disorder, and so on as well. Now, historians can know quite a lot about beer. Its importance meant that people invested a huge amount of time and resources in brewing and the related processes. And this expenditure leaves a written record, one that can be very detailed in some circumstances. The problem, though, is that historians have relied entirely on this sort of information to make very big assumptions about the quality of beer in this period. So, for example, trying to establish the alcohol or the protein profile of beer based on a calculation of how much grain was used to make it. And this has been used in very big assumptions about the amount of energy available to labourers and so on. or probably even more problematic, relying on the values of modern beers to make assumptions about drinking in the past. So all of these, they increase our knowledge, of course, but they're problematic because, of course, brewing equipment, conditions, techniques, and crucially the quantity or the quality of ingredients were markedly different in the past. And the properties of the final product can really only be assessed through a systematic interdisciplinary reconstruction and analysis of each stage of the brewing process. And so that's what we set out to do. Over 3 years, it took a very long time to get there, and COVID didn't help. But we started by examining accounts to identify a representative beer for reproduction. And we decided on an example from Dublin Castle, which I'll explain in a little bit. And then we sourced the most appropriate grains and hops. We malted and milled using contemporary techniques, or as close as we could get, and I'll explain. We worked with craftspeople, including wicker workers, coopers, coppersmiths, to replicate period technology. And this was very detailed, so everything down to modes of timekeeping were replicated for this project. We measured, mashed, and fermented using descriptions of contemporary processes and under very similar conditions. All of this was undertaken at the Weald and Downland Museum in Sussex, which is a fantastic place if you ever get a chance to visit. And this was chosen in part because the water quality was almost identical to the water we tested from the surviving medieval Dublin watercourse. So it was a really appropriate place for us to do it. But also, of course, because they very generously allowed us to transform their Tudor kitchen into a brew house for a couple of weeks. And then after replicating the brew house in collaboration with John Morrissey at UCC, who's a professor of microbiology, yeast was selected and trialed for fermentation. And that was quite a hugely groundbreaking aspect of this project. And then finally, we analyzed, or at least we're still analyzing the end product using scientific methods to establish its full nutritional profile. And that's been undertaken by brewing scientists at Nottingham University. And then in archaeological terms, because this project started quite small but seemed to grow and grow over time, introducing new elements like microbiology, but also bioarchaeology. So as part of this project, Professor Janet Montgomery, who's working on the Food Cult project at Durham, is also examining the beer to consider the impact of brewing on isotopes. So she's measuring changes in oxygen isotopes from initial cold water to beer, since, of course, as we've established, people drank so much beer. And this will be very important for how archaeologists use isotopes to understand human mobility and migration. And she's also examining changes in strontium, carbon, and nitrogen isotopes from cereals to beer, which is important for dietary studies. And this will be very important for us on the Food Cult project when we come to look at human skeletons, which is another aspect of the research. Now, of course, in the past, there was a huge amount of variability in all of these aspects. So what we arrived at, we can really only claim is a snapshot of the process. It's an end product that allows us to establish some parameters for early modern, post-medieval beers, and importantly, develop an interdisciplinary approach for extending this study to other geographical and temporal contexts. So what I'm going to do is work through these steps in a bit more detail. So beginning with the technology, how did we recreate a brew house? And this was led by Mark Meltonville, who's a food historian and who has quite a lot of experience in similar experiments. So in terms of recreating a brew house, well, the historical evidence is quite sparse. What exists across brewing manuals, images, occasional inventories, and so on, suggests that most of the equipment used was relatively simple and standardized, at least between the Middle Ages and the end of the 17th century. Not very much changes in that period. And it comprised a boiling vessel or a copper to heat the water. This lovely example was produced for us in Portugal. And then we need a mash tun or a tub where the water is added to the ground malt to release the fermentable sugars and produce the wort. And the mash tun is seen on the left-hand side in the image there. And then we needed brewing or stirring implements, a brewing oar and some stirring implements. an underbuck for collecting the wort when it drains from the mash tun, and ladles to move it from the copper for reboiling when we add the hops. And then things like cooling tubs and a cask in which to add yeast to allow the beer to ferment. So all of this was quite standard. The only exception to this standardization is in the mash tub. So the tub on the left hand side, which contains the malted grains and the hot water. So up until the end of the 17th century, as you can see in this nice action shot here, brewers used a method of top mashing. So the malt and the water are poured in from above, and after about an hour and a half, the wort is run off through a small drain hole in the tun, and the grains are kept back. And this requires a way of separating the wort and the grain. And visual and artifactual evidence indicates that there were three main methods in use in Europe. So a long tap, a huck-muck, and a tube tap method. Of these, the tube tap method seems to have been the most common in England. So that's the one that we went with. We didn't find evidence directly for a specific type of mash tub in Irish brewing, but we found some other evidence that would support that idea. So the importation in port books, for example, of taps and cannels, which are found in line with the growing importation of hops, suggest similar technology. And we have found reference in inventories and accounts of things like wort sieves and so on as well. It's unfortunate because I really wanted to make a huck muck. It's such a great name. Tube taps aren't quite as exciting, really. But we were helped in replicating this technology by images of historic brewing equipment showing the tube tap and the wilch. And the wilch that you can see there is a small woven filter that sits behind the tap in the tub, like this one illustrated here in Country Life magazine from 1949. Tube taps, along with this woven wicker flask cover, which shows the form that a wilch might have taken, were found on the wreck of the Mary Rose ship, so the 16th century ship, which provided an archaeological comparison and gave our wicker weaver something to work from. And here's our replica. And the tube taps were made by Robert Hoare, who's a historic woodworker, and the wilch was made by Linda Mills, a traditional wicker worker at the museum. And this is an image that shows you what it looks like in situ. If you look down into the mash tun, you can see this really simple filtration system behind. Other equipment that was replicated was an hourglass, which was intended to tell the time, since we were really certain that we wanted to keep everything as period as possible. And we didn't find any evidence for a clock at Dublin Castle in the 16th century. So this hourglass was replicated, again, modelled on artefacts on the Mary Rose. In reality, I have to be honest, people got into the habit of setting timers on their watches to remember to turn the hourglass over, but we did try. And this one shows you what the brew house looked like when it was fully set up. It's very atmospheric, but also I have to say very dusty, very smoky, and quite a hazardous space to work in. So then, in terms of ingredients, once the brew house was set up, in terms of ingredients, we needed to source barley and oat malt for this beer. And this, of course, presented challenges. So first, there's a lot of uncertainty surrounding the types of cereals in use in the early modern period. And second, even if we could distinguish which varieties were used for malting, the characteristics of early modern cereals were quite different from their modern counterparts. So until the early 20th century, before modern breeding, most crops were kept as landraces. And landrace seed is highly variable, so depending on where it's grown, individual crops were genetically very distinct. And few landraces survive today, even in cases where landrace seed has been preserved in gene banks. There's generally no written information about it. Very, very difficult to assess the provenance of it, for example. And often only very tiny quantities of seed are available, so it could take years and years to build up enough for an experiment like this. And that's if these seeds can even be shared for research purposes. And of course, this is very problematic because when successful cultivation of landrace varieties occurs, the older varieties are quite distinct. So the cereals grow taller and they have less standing ability than modern varieties. And you can see that very clearly in this image of Bear here on the screen. It's much taller and falls over a lot. It's got much smaller grains. And these characteristics impact on the nutritional properties and taste. So where brewing has been undertaken with land races, they've been shown to produce very distinctive flavors, but also lower alcohol level, mainly because of this smaller grain size. And this has implications, of course, for our understanding of ales and beers in the past. So to get as close as we could to a pre-modern barley, we used Bear barley from Orkney. And this was for a couple of reasons. First, in household accounts, in the Irish household accounts that we've used, barley malt is generally referred to as bear malt. And there are descriptions of Irish beer that suggest that this type of malt was specifically, this type of barley was specifically used in brewing. So one example is the journal of an English officer, John Stevens, in 1690. Similarly, Caleb Trelkild, an early modern botanist, wrote that bear was the barley most often used in malting in the 18th century. So some records to support this. The second reason was more practical, in that Bear is the only landrace barley still in commercial production. And thanks to the work of the Agronomy Institute on Orkney and the fact that they've developed numerous industries there like beer and whiskey and vinegar to support the conservation of Bear, it's available. And we were very fortunate that they agreed to work with us on this and supply us with barley. So this barley that you can see here is what we used in the brewing. Of course, what we're using is a distant cousin genetically to what was around in 16th century Ireland. And of course, this variation is what makes a landrace. Even Bear growing in two different fields on Orkney would be genetically distinctive. But its characteristics make it the closest possible match for what we wanted to achieve. Oats were more problematic. There's been a lot less research done on landrace oats. There's not really much of a market for them. So nothing is available commercially. We tried, I think we exhausted a number of routes. We worked with a farmer, Dominic Gryson, in County Dublin, who grows a wonderful heritage variety of oats called Sonus. But two attempts to make malt failed, and we're not sure why. So we'll probably continue experimenting with that in the future. In the end, we used a modern flaked oat malt along with the Bear, which was the best that we could do. But definitely identifying areas for further research. Research on oats would be invaluable here, and it would be really nice to come back and do this again using landrace oats as well. The next stage was making malt from the grains. Building a malt house was outside the scope of this project, but again, that would be another very worthwhile project. We sent our Bear and oats to Warminster Malting in the UK, which was established in 1855. Warminster uses a very traditional method of floor malting, as you can see here in this image. And it basically comprises a steeping trough next to a clay germination floor and then a wood-fired kiln. And this is really similar to processes identified at excavated malt houses. And it fits with contemporary descriptions, and we have a lot of contemporary descriptions of malting in the 16th and 17th centuries. And then the malt was milled using a hand quern. For large brew houses like Dublin Castle, malt was most likely milled at a local watermill, but we certainly do have evidence from the late 16th century in inventories, for example, such as the one from Castle Island in Kerry, of hand milling malt using a quern. And so for consistency, we decided to mill all of our malt by hand. And I have to say, my arm still hurts. And that was the one aspect I thought where I discovered that I would never have made a good early modern housewife. But again, there's room for further experiment here. So what would happen if you compared brews using malt milled with different techniques, so a water mill versus a quernstone, and so on. We don't have descriptions of the consistency of the actual grist in this period. At least if we do, they're very vague. A variety of different querns were used by us, including a rotary quern, which we would expect to be more contemporary with the 16th century, but this produced too much flour. So with some advice from the malters, we learned that the standard milling process today produces 20-70-10 grist, so 20% husk, 70% grits, and 10% flour. And we eventually reached something very similar to that by modifying the quern that you can see here, and that worked very well. Finding hops was the next big adventure. From the 16th century onwards, a lot of beer and indeed ale in Ireland was hopped. And this was a Dutch innovation that was imported to Ireland. So not as some would have it, an English innovation brought to Ireland by colonisation. Given that the accounts specify the use of Flemish hops, as you can see here, the focus centred on locating a surviving heritage variety with roots in Flanders. One of the earliest varieties introduced from Flanders was the so-called Flemish red vine. And unfortunately, none of those have survived in collections. The most similar surviving variety is the Tallhearts hop. And this is a red vine hop that was introduced to England by Tallhearts in 1882. And its distinguishing feature is that it has a highly uncommon tolerance of the aphid pest, which has led hops experts, including Peter Darby, who you can see picture here, who worked with us, to consider this a direct descendant of early Flemish hops, which also had this resistance to the aphid pest. And they were sometimes called the never black. The problem was that there were only 2 surviving plants in the National Hops collection and a further 3 in private collections. So it took us a total of around 3 years to build up enough hops for the experiment. But we finally got there in the end, and learned a lot about sustainability and climate change on the impact of that on hops in the meantime. So lots of patience was required in gathering these materials. And this shows us harvesting this year's crop, which was just last month, literally the day before we needed to use it for brewing. And then next, finding yeast, I think, was probably one of the most groundbreaking aspects of the project. For this, we collaborated with John Morrissey at UCC. He used genotype analysis of strains of yeast culture to identify an example most similar to the ancestral strain of ale yeast. So this, what you see here, is the yeast family tree. We were looking for something as close as possible genetically to beer 1 clade down at the very bottom of that tree. And a couple of candidates were recovered, but in the end we used this one, 1026, which was the closest we could find to the founder strain, or to the root of the tree. And it was taken from the UK National Collection, and it was recovered, and it was grown to an inoculum in Cork in the lab, and then it was brought over for us to use at the museum. And John himself came over to inoculate the beer, which was very exciting for all of us. Then in terms of the actual process, well, in broad terms, historians identify 3 main strengths of beer in the records. So strong beer, ordinary beer, and household beer. Within these categories, there's a lot of variation. But of these, so-called middle or ordinary beer is the most often consumed malt liquor overall, especially by the working classes. And that's what we found as well. In annual accounts from Dublin Castle, 87% of the beer produced was ordinary beer. Small beer, interestingly, isn't found in any of the Irish accounts that we examined. Probably it was considered unsuitable for working adults, as it was elsewhere, because of its thinness and its weakness. So we chose to replicate an ordinary beer, which was relatively representative of everyday drinking habits of the masses. The recipe was chosen from an account from 1574 from Dublin Castle. So this is a good quality ordinary beer. But importantly, the amount of grain used to make that beer in the accounts over time was very consistent. And the proportions were 11 3/4 hogsheads made 47 bushels of malt. It was half oats and half barley. So a bushel of malt, this is our bushel here, gave 13.5 gallons of beer. This was a very high ratio of oats, which was interesting. It's much higher than English recipes, but much more similar to what we know of Northern European beers and also late medieval English examples. In other accounts, we're finding beers of up to 100% oat malt. So it was important for us to assess the significance of brewing with oats. These accounts don't just give us the volumes of grain used, but the amount of beer produced from that grain. We wanted to get really close to the end result of what they were making. So we retrofitted the amount of water added at the start to end up with the exact amount produced. And I think, again, that makes this experiment quite unique. So we used some unpublished manuscripts by Hugh Platt, and some brewing instructions by Edward Whittaker, who suggested that the proportion was 5:3. So if you want 3 gallons of beer, you add 5 gallons of water. And that worked out to be quite accurate over the experiment. So we can brew 1 barrel a day with this equipment. We ended up brewing 2 bushels a day and producing 27 gallons of beer. The water was heated in the copper every day. Water was poured over the grain. It rested for an hour and a half, and the resulting wort was drained off. You can see the system worked beautifully here. Look at all that lovely sugar. At this stage, if we'd added the hops to the first wash, we'd have had a strong beer. But to achieve an ordinary beer, a second wash of water was placed on the grains, and it was rested again for an hour and a half. And then the wort from both washes was combined and boiled with the hops. We used period temperature control measures. So according to contemporary descriptions, it's cool enough to add the water to the grain when you can see your face in the water. And we backed this up using modern methods. But that turned out to be in the early 70s, which seems quite low, but it was supported by Watkins in the Complete English Brewer, who noted that the water needs to be cooler when brewing with oats. And we learned this the hard way, because one day the water was too hot and we ended up with a very, very big batch of porridge instead of beer. And then after cooling, the yeast is added and it ferments for 5 to 7 days. And then the beer is taken and put into casks. And we repeated this 4 times, 3 of which were successful with the Dublin Castle recipe. And then we ran a control using modern malt and yeast. And then a 5th brew using the Dublin Castle volumes, but just made with pure bear. So we left out the oats this time. And this was to produce a comparative beer that was a bit closer to the contemporary English version. So to test the relative nutritional value of the oats. And here is the UCC yeast in action. We're waiting for some lab results from that. This was interesting. The modern live ale yeast that we used in the control died under these quite primitive conditions, I suppose. It was too slow to work, so the beer became contaminated and it didn't ferment. Whereas the older yeast, as you can see here, worked really fast and seemed to be more suited to these open brewing conditions. And then throughout the experiment, we, or at least our postdoc Charlie Taverner, collected many samples for analysis, which is still ongoing. But this is the final beer that we produced. You can see it's interesting. For some reason I thought it would be darker, but it's very light straw-colored beer. I unfortunately haven't tasted it myself, but I'm getting regular reports on what it tastes like. Apparently, it's not very bitter. It has just a note of bitterness. It's very light, like you'd expect from a table beer. You could drink it with a meal and find it quite pleasant. According to our brewer, there's a distinct note of oak in the background, or what he says could be described as a hint of damp barrel. But everyone agrees that it's very easy to drink, which might be why people drank so much of it. It's currently at the Centre for Brewing Science in Nottingham, but I can give you some provisional results that came in just yesterday. So we haven't had a chance to fully interpret this yet. But of the 3 Dublin Castle beers, in terms of alcohol, there was one outlier with an alcohol volume of about 2%. The other 2 were 5 and 4.5% respectively. The last 2, of course, were brewed when the brewers had developed some proficiency with the conditions and technology, so presumably more accurate. They were much higher than the pure barley beer, which was only 3%. So this is a relatively high amount of alcohol if you're drinking between 5 and 14 pints a day, not dissimilar from modern beer in terms of alcohol content. The oat beers had a higher calorie content than the barley beer, around 180 calories per pint, but we're very sure this will be revised up with further research. And all the beers had a very high protein content compared to modern beers, especially the barley beer. So that's something that we're going to be looking at in more detail. We're running all these tests again in the next couple of weeks because we think that the values will change after the beer has had some time to settle. So these were tested at the tunning stage. Some fermentation afterwards that takes place might change this. If it continues to ferment, it will use up a bit more sugar. So if it was casked for any length of time, the results could be quite different. And then once we've done that and analysed all the results, we'll be able to formally publish this. But the story doesn't end here. We've documented this entire process from manuscripts through fields to brew houses to the final cup of beer by working with a film team from Story Lab at Anglia Ruskin in Cambridge. So yet another interdisciplinary dimension to all of this, bringing the creative arts in to explore how the history of food and drink can be told through film. And all of our results will be on the website, along with an online exhibition that we're currently curating. So we'll be able to explain this process again in more detail, and you can follow our progress there. So I suppose to sum up, what's the major significance at this stage of this project? I guess what we learn, or what we're learning about beer here, will hugely improve our understanding of diet in the past in historical and in archaeological terms. But for me, I think the main significance is the interdisciplinarity. It shows really how an ordinary everyday foodstuff can become a site for this sort of radical interdisciplinarity across archaeology, science, and the humanities, and even the creative arts. And it brings all of these really diverse disciplines together to answer some very important central questions. I mean, who would ever imagine that historians and microbiologists could find common ground? You know, we often speak different languages, but we can learn an awful lot from each other. And I think the development of these remarkably exciting collaborations will lead to many new projects over time. So I'll leave it there. Thank you very much